Story 1. Elmer Leon Carroll was born on August 19, 1956, in the United States. He was a white male whose childhood was far from happy. Carroll grew up in a family with many problems, and family members later said that he was physically abused as a child. He was also sexually abused during his childhood, and a police report from 1969 documented that abuse. As he grew older, he became increasingly distant from his family, and many of his relatives later said they had not seen him for many years before his trial. Carroll struggled in school and completed only the 7th grade. His reading ability was at a 2nd grade level, his spelling was at a 3rd grade level, and his arithmetic skills were at a 5th grade level. His learning difficulties had been recognized from an early age. Tests taken when he was 12 and 13 years old showed that his IQ was around 80, and those results were consistent with later evaluations. One expert later concluded that Carroll had a full-scale IQ of 81. Although other tests produced scores between 60 and 69, doctors believed those lower results were caused either by his lack of cooperation during testing or by psychotic episodes. Overall, his intelligence was considered to be in the borderline range, which falls between intellectual disability and low average intelligence. Carroll also began drinking alcohol at a very young age. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already drinking heavily, and he also used drugs, developing a long history of substance abuse. His drinking caused blackouts, and he suffered several blows to the head over the years that caused him to lose consciousness. Throughout his life, he also struggled with mental health problems. He showed symptoms of schizophrenia, psychosis, and personality disorders. He experienced paranoid thoughts, sometimes heard voices, and his mental condition remained unstable for many years. His legal troubles also began early in life. On March 26, 1976, Carroll committed an offense of lewd and lascivious conduct with a child under the age of 16. He was sentenced for that crime on January 8, 1980, and received a prison sentence of 6 years and 1 day. He remained incarcerated from January 1980 until May 1982. After his release, he committed the same type of offense again. On November 14, 1982, he once again committed lewd and lascivious conduct with a child under 16. He was sentenced on February 1, 1983, and this time received a much longer sentence of 15 years. He remained in prison from February 1983 until April 1990. During those prison terms, Carroll was evaluated by mental health professionals. At different times, he was described as having antisocial personality traits along with other mental disorders. Some evaluators also believed he was malingering, meaning they thought he was pretending to be more seriously mentally ill than he actually was. After his release from prison in April 1990, Carroll did not have a stable place to live. He became a resident of a halfway house called the Lighthouse Mission, a facility for homeless men and ex-convicts located in Apopka, Florida. Carroll lived in a travel trailer on the mission's property. He did not have a job or a regular routine, and spent most of his time at the halfway house, occasionally visiting local taverns. Other residents at the mission noticed that Carroll sometimes behaved strangely. He would talk to himself or even to his jacket. On some occasions, he spoke about demons and Satan. He also made comments to other residents about the family living next door to the mission, specifically mentioning the young girl who lived there. He said she was cute and sweet, and that she liked to watch him make boats. Although other residents noticed these remarks, they did not consider them a serious concern at the time. Carroll continued living at the mission and going about his daily activities, and his life remained quiet and uneventful during the months following his release from prison. Elmer Carroll continued living at the Lighthouse Mission halfway house in Apopka, Florida, after his release from prison. The family living next door included 10-year-old Christine McGowan, who lived with her mother, Julie McGowan, and her stepfather, Robert Rank. Christine was a fifth-grade student at Lockhart Elementary School. Her teachers and family described her as a helpful and big-hearted girl. She loved writing stories, enjoyed playing Nintendo, and liked going on family outings. Just a week before the crime, her family had visited Busch Gardens, where she had enjoyed getting soaked on the rides. Christine was also known for always offering to help others, whether it was washing the board for her teacher or picking up pine needles for a neighbor. On the evening of October 29, 1990, Christine went to bed at about 8 p.m. Her mother, Julie, left for work at around 9 p.m. After Julie left, Robert Rank locked the front door and went to bed at approximately 11 p.m. Around midnight, he got up to get a drink of tea and checked on Christine before returning to bed. Her bedroom door was open and everything appeared normal, so he went back to sleep. While the household slept, Carol left the halfway house next door and went to Christine's home. He entered the house without leaving any signs of forced entry. Investigators believed he entered through the front door, which may have been unlocked or easily opened. He then went into Christine's bedroom. Although the bedroom door had been open earlier, it was later found closed. Once inside the room, Carol attacked Christine while she was in her bed. Carol first struck Christine on the left side of her head. The blow caused blunt force trauma, but did not knock her unconscious. She remained conscious and aware during what followed. Carol then sexually battered her, tearing her vagina with his penis. The injury caused severe pain, comparable to the pain of childbirth. He also attempted to penetrate her anus, causing redness and irritation to her rectum. Because she remained awake throughout the assault, she would have experienced all of this pain. After the sexual battery, Carol strangled Christine. He used his hands to press down on her mouth and block her airway. She suffered injuries to her upper lip that were consistent with someone holding a hand over her mouth, as well as abrasions and contusions to her neck. Strangulation does not cause death immediately. It takes approximately 3 to 4 minutes of complete airway obstruction to cause death, and Christine would have remained conscious for 1 to 2 minutes before losing consciousness. During that time, she would have experienced fear and the terrifying sensation of being unable to breathe. She was aware of what was happening to her and experienced both pain and terror before dying from asphyxia, meaning a lack of oxygen to the brain. After Christine died, Carol left her body face down on the bed beneath the covers. He then went to the front of the house, where he noticed that Robert Rank's truck was parked in the yard with the keys still inside. Carol took the truck and drove away from the scene. It was a white construction truck with the ATC logo on the side. At about 6 a.m., he stopped at a 7-Eleven store near Apopka and had a cup of coffee. 2 witnesses later reported seeing him driving the truck that morning and identified him. Later that morning, Carol abandoned the white truck on the side of a highway. After parking it, he began walking eastward away from the vehicle. He was wearing a brown jacket and had long, scraggly hair. He continued walking down the highway without carrying anything. Back at Christine's home, Robert Rank woke shortly before 6 a.m. on October 30th, 1990, and went to wake Christine for school. When she did not respond to his calls, he went to her bedroom and noticed that the door was closed, which was unusual because it had been open at midnight. He opened the door and found Christine lying face down on her bed. He tried to shake her awake, but she was cold to the touch. When he turned her over, he saw blood between her legs. He realized she was not breathing and that she was dead. He then noticed that the front door was slightly open and that his truck, which had been parked outside with the keys in it, was missing. Rank called for help, and when police arrived, they examined Christine's body. They immediately determined that she had been raped and strangled to death. Investigators also found that the front door had been opened from either the inside or the outside without any signs of forced entry. Police issued a BOLO, or Be on the Lookout, bulletin for the missing white construction truck, describing both the vehicle and the ATC logo on its side so that other officers and members of the public could watch for it. At that point, investigators were faced with the murder of a child, a missing truck, and no clear suspect. They knew the crime had occurred while Christine's mother was at work and her stepfather was asleep in another room. They also knew that someone had entered the home, attacked Christine, and then left in the truck. Debbie Hyatt was driving to work on the morning of October 30th, 1990. She was traveling on Highway 50 east of Orlando when, at about 6:50 a.m., she noticed a white pickup truck parked near her residence. The truck had the ATC logo on its side. About a mile farther down the road, she saw a man walking east along the highway. He had long, scraggly hair and was wearing a brown jacket. At the time, she did not think much of what she had seen. Later that morning, however, she heard a radio bulletin about a missing white construction truck with the ATC logo. She immediately realized that the truck she had seen was the one police were searching for. She contacted the police and told them what she had observed, including a description of the man she had seen walking away from the truck. At about the same time, Carl Young, a state wildlife officer, was also traveling on the roads that morning. Near the intersection of Highway 50, he noticed a man with shoulder-length hair, wearing a brown jacket, walking along the highway without carrying anything. Young thought the man's behavior was unusual. As Young drove past, the man looked back at him. Young continued driving before turning onto Highway 50, where he saw a deputy sheriff standing behind a white pickup truck with his gun drawn. Young returned to assist, and by then another deputy had arrived. He heard Debbie Hyatt describing the man she had seen walking away from the truck, and her description matched the man Young had just passed. Young immediately drove back to the area where Carol was still walking down the road. He called out to Carol, but Carol continued walking. Young then drew his gun and ordered Carol to lie down on the ground. Carol obeyed and lay down. Young searched Carol for weapons and found a box cutter razor blade in his pocket. He also felt a hard object in another pocket and removed it, discovering a set of keys. Young radioed one of the deputies who was still at the white truck, and the deputy checked the keys against the vehicle. The number on the keys matched the number on the truck. At that point, Young and the other deputies placed Carol under arrest. The keys were strong evidence that Carol had taken the truck from Christine's home. When officers searched Carol more thoroughly, they found blood on his sweatshirt and also found blood on his penis. This became important physical evidence. Carol was taken to the police station for questioning and for the collection of additional evidence from his body. Meanwhile, forensic investigators collected evidence from Christine's body and from the crime scene. They recovered semen, saliva, and pubic hair from Christine's body, and they also documented the blood found between her legs. All of this evidence was sent to a laboratory for testing. As the investigation continued, detectives examined Carol's connection to the neighborhood. They learned that he was living at the Lighthouse Mission halfway house, which was located directly next door to Christine's home. Investigators interviewed other residents at the mission. One resident told police that Carol had made comments about the young girl living next door, saying she was cute and sweet, and that she liked to watch him make boats. Those statements showed that Carol had noticed Christine before the crime and had spoken about her to other people. The DNA testing was conducted by the FBI laboratory. The results showed that the saliva, semen, and pubic hair recovered from Christine's body matched Carol's DNA. One DNA profile obtained from a specimen collected from the victim matched Carol's DNA profile exactly. The blood found on Carol's sweatshirt and on his penis also linked him directly to the crime. Together, the physical evidence strongly connected Carol to the sexual assault and murder of Christine McGowan. Carol was formally charged on November 26, 1990. He was indicted on 2 counts: first-degree murder and sexual battery on a person under the age of 12. The case went to trial on March 16, 1992, before Judge Belvin Perry. Carroll's defense attorney, James E. Taylor, presented an insanity defense, arguing that Carroll was mentally ill and did not know right from wrong at the time of the crime. The defense called several mental health experts, including Dr. Elizabeth McMahon, Dr. Jeffrey Danziger, and Dr. Edward Benson. They testified that Carroll was psychotic, suffered from schizophrenia, and was not responsible for his actions. According to their testimony, he was experiencing hallucinations and was unable to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution responded with its own mental health experts. Dr. Robert Kirkland and Dr. Michael Gutman testified for the state. Dr. Kirkland stated that Carroll knew what he was doing and understood that it was wrong. Dr. Gutman testified that Carroll had been malingering during his examinations, meaning he was pretending to be more seriously mentally ill than he actually was. He also testified that Carroll had high average intelligence, was capable of controlling his behavior, and had an antisocial personality disorder, but was not legally insane. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence to the jury. Jurors were shown the keys found on Carroll, along with the blood, semen, and DNA evidence linking him to the crime. They also viewed photographs documenting Christine's injuries. The medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Hedgert, testified about the autopsy, explaining in detail how Christine had been beaten, raped, and strangled. He described the pain she would have suffered and explained how long it would have taken for her to die. After hearing all of the testimony and reviewing the evidence, the jury found Carroll guilty on both counts: first-degree murder and sexual battery on a child under the age of 12. The trial then moved into the penalty phase to determine whether Carroll would receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. The defense argued that Carroll's mental condition should be considered a mitigating factor, pointing to his mental illness as well as his history of abuse and substance abuse. Rather than calling new witnesses, the defense relied on the testimony already presented during the guilt phase. They also submitted the 1969 police report documenting the sexual abuse Carroll had suffered as a child. The prosecution argued that the death penalty was appropriate and presented several aggravating factors. They pointed out that Carroll had previously been convicted of 2 felonies involving violence or the threat of violence, referring to his 2 earlier convictions for lewd and lascivious conduct involving children. They also argued that the murder had been committed during the course of a sexual battery, which was another aggravating factor. Finally, they maintained that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Based on the evidence of Christine's suffering, the judge agreed that these aggravating factors applied. The jury was then asked to recommend a sentence, and they voted unanimously, 12-0, in favor of the death penalty. Judge Perry followed the jury's recommendation. On April 16, 1992, he sentenced Elmer Carroll to death for the first-degree murder conviction and to life imprisonment for the sexual battery conviction. In a detailed sentencing order, the judge explained his reasons for finding the aggravating factors. He also recognized the non-statutory mitigating factor that Carroll suffered from some possible mental abnormalities and has an antisocial personality. However, he concluded that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors. He described the crime as savage and barbaric and stated that Christine McGowan did not meet a swift, merciful, and relatively painless death. After his conviction and sentencing, Carroll began a series of appeals that continued for more than 20 years. His direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court was filed on May 7, 1992. On April 14, 1994, the Florida Supreme Court upheld both his conviction and his death sentence. The United States Supreme Court denied his petition for review on October 31, 1994. Carroll then filed several motions for post-conviction relief, raising claims that included ineffective assistance of counsel and other issues. He filed his first motion on February 1, 1996, and the Florida Supreme Court denied that appeal on March 7, 2002. He filed a second post-conviction motion on April 22, 2003, arguing that he was mentally retarded and therefore could not be executed under the United States Supreme Court's decision in Atkins v. Virginia. The trial court denied that motion on January 12, 2004, and the Florida Supreme Court affirmed the denial on May 12, 2005. Carroll also filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court. He submitted the petition on June 8, 2005, in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida, raising several claims, including his argument that he was mentally retarded. The District Court denied the petition on June 20, 2008. Carroll then appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, which affirmed the denial on July 24, 2009. The United States Supreme Court denied his final petition on November 2, 2009. During his years on death row, Carroll accumulated a history of prison disciplinary infractions. He received 20 disciplinary reports, including violations for attempted arson, possession of contraband, and making threats. He was also cited for disorderly conduct, disrespect toward officials, and disobeying orders. By that time, he had been in prison since his arrest in 1990 and had spent more than 20 years on death row. On May 29, 2013, Carroll's execution was carried out by lethal injection at Florida State Prison near Stark, Florida. He was 56 years old. The execution process began at 6:01 p.m. Earlier that morning, he had eaten his final meal, which included sunny-side-up eggs with bacon and sliced tomatoes, biscuits, avocados, a fruit salad consisting of strawberries, papaya, peaches, and pineapple, along with canned milk. Before the execution, he received 2 visitors, a mitigation specialist and a Catholic priest. No members of his family visited him. When prison officials asked whether he wished to make a final statement, Carroll replied, "No, sir." A prison physician pronounced him dead at 6:12 p.m. after using a stethoscope to check his chest. 5 members of Christine McGowan's family witnessed the execution. Although they did not speak directly to the media, they released a statement through a prison spokesperson that read, "Thank you to all that have worked so hard, and justice for all, namely Christine McGowan. Rest in peace." The Orange Osceola State Attorney Jeff Ashton, who had prosecuted the case, also attended the execution. Reflecting on the outcome, he said, "For me, it's completion. The execution brought finality to a case that had lasted 23 years. Christine McGowan's family had waited more than 2 decades for justice. Throughout that time, the legal process carefully reviewed all of Carroll's claims and appeals, and every court that considered the case upheld both his conviction and his death sentence. Carroll's life ended at Florida State Prison, but Christine's memory remained with her family and everyone who had known her. She was remembered as a helpful, big-hearted girl who loved writing stories and helping others. Although her life was cut tragically short, the justice system ultimately held her killer accountable for his actions. Story 2. Elroy Chester was born on June 14, 1969, in Jefferson County, Texas, an area that includes the city of Port Arthur, where he would spend most of his life. He was a black male who grew up in a family that included his father, his mother, and at least one sister. His sister later had a common-law husband named Albert Bolden, showing that Chester had family connections in the area. Not much is publicly known about his early childhood or his parents' occupations, but he remained close enough to his father to visit him later in life. Chester attended school in Port Arthur, where he completed his education from elementary school through high school, finishing all 12 years of schooling. However, his time in school was difficult because he struggled with learning from a very young age. When he was 7 years old, the school gave him an IQ test, and he received a full-scale score of 69. At the age of 12, he was tested again, and this time his full-scale score was 59, which is very low. A year later, when he was 13, he took another IQ test and scored 77. Because of these low scores and his ongoing academic difficulties, he was placed in special education classes. He remained in special education from the 3rd grade all the way through the 12th grade. The school system did not classify him as mentally retarded. Instead, he was identified as learning disabled. Even so, both his teachers and other students noticed that he was different. Other children often called him stupid and retarded. He also had significant trouble speaking clearly, frequently using jumbled sentences and misusing words. The school diagnosed him with a serious communication handicap and provided speech therapy to help improve his communication. Despite that support, his reading and writing skills remained very poor into adulthood. By the time he was 18 years old, he could only read small words, and he could not name the months of the year in order. After finishing school, Chester found work as a laborer, doing physical jobs that required little reading or writing. For about 11 months in 1992, he worked at a local restaurant called Luby's Cafeteria in Port Arthur. There, he worked alongside a female co-worker named Cheryl DeLeon. During his time at Luby's, Chester frequently sexually harassed Cheryl. She did not tolerate his behavior and reported him to their supervisor, creating tension between them. Chester never forgot that she had complained about him, and he held a grudge against her afterward. This reflected a pattern of holding on to anger and resentment toward people he believed had wronged him. As he entered adulthood, Chester also continued to have problems with the law. Before the age of 30, he had already established a criminal record. He was convicted of burglary in Jefferson County. Burglary means breaking into a building with the intent to steal. He received a 10-year prison sentence for 1 count of burglary of a building. He also received a 13-year sentence for 1 count of burglary of a habitation, which means breaking into a person's home, along with 2 additional counts of burglary of a building. These sentences were served at the same time. Chester was released on parole on February 13, 1990. However, he did not remain out of trouble for long. He violated the conditions of his parole, meaning he broke the rules that allowed him to remain free. As a result, he was returned to prison on January 11, 1994. During this period of incarceration, he had a disagreement with a white staff member over a disciplinary report, meaning a prison employee had written him up for breaking a prison rule. Chester became angry about the incident, and that anger continued to grow. He later said that this single event caused him to develop hatred toward white people in general, and he carried those feelings with him for years. Chester remained in prison until he was released on mandatory supervision, a type of release that occurs automatically after a prisoner has served enough time. He was released on March 21, 1997, when he was 27 years old. He left prison with a criminal record, a limited education, poor reading skills, a grudge against a former co-worker, and a deep-seated anger toward white people that he said had developed while he was behind bars. After his release, he returned to Jefferson County, where he was expected to follow the conditions of his mandatory supervision. At that time, he did not have a stable home or a steady job. He had spent much of his life moving in and out of institutions. From his earlier burglaries, he had learned some basic criminal patterns, and he had also learned from his mistakes while in prison. Although he was free again, he had no clear plan for building a lawful life. Up to that point, his life had been marked by struggles in school, conflict at work, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system. He was now back on the streets of Port Arthur with his anger and his old habits, and he had to figure out what to do next. Within just a few months, he began a long series of burglaries and violent attacks across Port Arthur. He returned to the same methods he had used before, walking through neighborhoods in search of houses to break into. He carried a pair of gloves, a knitted hat with 2 holes cut out to use as a ski mask, and a gun. The gun was a .380 semi-automatic pistol that he had stolen during an earlier burglary from the home of a man named Kenneth Reisinger. Chester had scratched the serial numbers off the gun, so it could not be traced easily. He also carried wire cutters. These became his standard equipment. On August 3, 1997, Chester broke into Kenneth Reisinger's home and stole the pistol. 6 days later, on August 9th, he broke into another home. Inside, he found a 10-year-old girl. Wearing a hockey mask, he forced the girl into a closet and tied her up with tape before anally raping her. This was his first known sexual assault since his release. 1 week later, on the night of August 16th, Chester attempted to burglarize 2 different homes. At the first house, he woke a 16-year-old boy named Oscar Morales by shouting through his bedroom window and demanding money. When Oscar tried to leave the room, Chester shot him in the leg. Later that same night, he woke another resident, Matthew Horvrich, in the same way. When Matthew got up and came to the window, Chester shot him in the shoulder. Both victims survived their injuries, and Chester fled both scenes without being caught. On September 20th, 1997, Chester broke into the home of 78-year-old John Henry Cepeda. As he typically did before a burglary, he cut the phone lines outside the house. Wearing his ski mask and carrying his gun and a flashlight, he entered the bedroom where John was sleeping beside his wife, Lupe. Chester began searching for valuables while they slept, but John woke up and saw him. John got out of bed and approached Chester, who responded by shooting and killing him. Before leaving, Chester demanded that Lupe hand over the ring she was wearing. She complied, and he fled with the ring and other stolen property. On November 15, 1997, Chester targeted another elderly couple. He went to the home of 87-year-old Etta Mae Stallings, who lived with her bedridden husband, who was unable to move. Once again, Chester cut the phone lines before entering. Wearing his ski mask and carrying his gun and flashlight, he first watched the house to make sure it was safe to enter. He broke in while Etta and her husband were asleep and began searching their bedroom for valuables. Etta woke up, reached into her dresser drawer, and pulled out a gun in an attempt to defend herself. Chester reacted immediately, shooting and killing her. Afterward, he took the stolen property, including Etta's own gun. He hid both the stolen items and Etta's gun beneath a nearby vacant house before leaving. 5 days later, on November 20th, 1997, Chester committed his next murder. His target was Cheryl DeLeon, a woman he had worked with several years earlier at Luby's cafeteria. Chester remembered that Cheryl worked the evening shift and finished work at 8 p.m. That evening, after dark, he went to her home wearing his mask and gloves and carrying his gun. This time, he changed part of his routine. He unscrewed the light bulb that illuminated a storage shed near the back door, creating a dark place to hide. He lay on the ground beside the shed and waited in the darkness for 30 to 45 minutes until Cheryl arrived home. When Cheryl pulled into the driveway, got out of her car, and walked toward the back door, Chester rushed out and grabbed her. The two struggled, and Cheryl screamed. Chester struck her on the side of the head with his gun. According to his later statement, the gun discharged accidentally when he hit her. The bullet struck Cheryl and killed her. Chester fled the scene and went to his father's house, where he climbed into the attic and hid the gun. On December 21st, 1997, Chester killed again. This time, the victim was 35-year-old Albert Bolden, the common-law husband of Chester's sister. Chester had 2 reasons for wanting Albert dead. First, Albert had been beating Chester's sister. Second, Albert had arranged a date for Chester with a woman who turned out to be a transvestite, something that made Chester angry. Chester came up with a plan. He invited Albert to join him in committing a burglary, telling him that he knew of a vacant house they could break into together. In reality, Chester never intended to burglarize the house. His only goal was to kill Albert. When they arrived, Chester directed Albert to enter first. As soon as Albert walked inside and turned his back, Chester shot him in the back of the head. Albert fell to the floor and died. Chester fled the scene and hid the gun he had used. By this point, Chester had killed 4 people, wounded several others, raped a young girl, and burglarized numerous homes. But he did not stop. On February 6, 1998, Chester once again walked through a Port Arthur neighborhood looking for a house to burglarize. He was carrying his gloves, his homemade ski mask, his stolen gun with the scratched-off serial numbers, and his wire cutters. Eventually, he came to a house he recognized because he had burglarized it before. Inside the home, 17-year-old Erin DeLeon was alone with her 1-year-old son, Tony. Her mother, Kim Ryman DeLeon, was at work, and her younger sisters, Claire and Sasha, were away from the house. Erin had put her baby to bed, spoken with her boyfriend on the telephone, and was now sitting in the living room watching a movie. The window blinds were open, allowing Chester to see that she was alone. After watching Erin through the window, Chester walked around to the side of the house. As he always did before committing a burglary, he used his wire cutters to cut the telephone lines. He then checked the side door and found it unlocked. After putting on his mask and gloves, he entered through the kitchen and walked into the living room, where Erin was sitting. Chester grabbed Erin by her hair, pressed the gun against her head, and demanded money or jewelry. Erin told him there was jewelry in the house, but no money. Still gripping her by the hair, Chester dragged her through the house, forcing her to open the doors to her mother's bedroom and her sister's bedrooms so he could make sure no one else was home. He asked where her mother was and when she would return. Erin told him her mother would be back in the morning. He also asked who she had been talking to on the phone, and she replied that it had been her boyfriend. Chester searched each bedroom and took jewelry. He then brought Erin into the dining room and ordered her to turn off all the lights in the house. After that, he dragged her into the garage, still pulling her by the hair. Erin offered to switch on the garage light, but Chester refused. Feeling around in the darkness, he found a roll of duct tape. He knew exactly where it was because he had been inside the house during an earlier burglary. As Chester and Erin returned from the garage, Erin's 14-year-old sister, Claire, arrived home with her boyfriend, Tim. They tried to enter through the side door, but Chester had earlier ordered Erin to lock it. Claire knocked on the door. Chester pulled Erin over, hid behind her with the gun pointed at her head, and ordered her to unlock the door and let Claire inside. As soon as Claire entered, Chester shoved Erin forward and warned Claire not to say anything or he would blow Erin's head off. Frightened, Claire began babbling. Tim was still outside on the porch. Hearing Claire's voice, he asked what was wrong. Chester ordered Claire to tell Tim that everything was fine and that he should leave. Claire did as she was told, but Tim remained outside. Chester then spoke directly to Tim and ordered him to come inside. Tim asked if he could first turn off his car because the engine was still running. Chester agreed but warned that if Tim tried to drive away, he would kill both girls. Tim turned off the engine and entered the house. Chester now had 3 captives. Still holding Erin by her ponytail with the gun pressed to her head, he demanded money or jewelry from Claire and Tim. They said they had neither. Tim showed him his empty wallet, and Claire went to her mother's bedroom to confirm that there was no more jewelry in the house. When she returned, Chester asked Tim what kind of car he drove and whether it had an automatic or manual transmission. Erin later understood from those questions that Chester intended to use Tim's car to escape. Afterward, Chester ordered Claire and Tim into the bathroom. Chester was now alone with Erin in the dark dining room. He ordered her to remove her clothes, and she began doing so. He tried to remove her bra himself before taking off her underwear. Erin was left wearing only her socks. He ordered her to kneel and blindfolded her with duct tape. He then called Tim out of the bathroom and ordered him to remove all of his clothes except his underwear and socks. Tim complied. Chester blindfolded Tim with duct tape and bound his wrists and ankles before dragging him into Aaron's bedroom. Chester then returned to the dining room and ordered Claire out of the bathroom. He made her remove her clothes, and she obeyed. He blindfolded her with duct tape and made her sit on the floor beside Aaron. Although Aaron was blindfolded, she managed to pull the tape down enough to see Chester unzipping his pants and pulling up his mask. Chester noticed and immediately pushed the tape back over her eyes. He then raped Aaron on the floor. When he finished, Aaron tried to stand, but Chester pulled her over to a chair and forced her to perform oral sex on him. Throughout the assault, he held the gun against her forehead and threatened to shoot her if she tried to bite him. Afterward, Aaron moved to the side of the room. Chester then ordered Claire to perform oral sex on him as well, threatening to shoot her if she bit him. Claire obeyed. At that moment, a vehicle pulled up outside the house. Hearing it arrive, Chester hurried into the kitchen and pulled his clothes back on. He then positioned himself beside the side door to wait for whoever was coming inside. The person at the door was Billy Ryman III, the brother of Aaron's mother, Kim. Billy was the girl's 38-year-old uncle and worked as a firefighter in Port Arthur. He often stopped by to check on his nieces while their mother was at work. His girlfriend, Marcia Sharp, remained waiting in his truck in the driveway. Billy opened the side door and switched on the light. Chester shouted for him to come inside. Billy stepped through the doorway, and Chester immediately shot him. Billy collapsed to the ground. Chester dragged his body into the kitchen, where Billy died from the gunshot wound. Chester then ran out of the house. Claire quickly got up and locked the side door behind him, trapping him outside. Marcia Sharp was still sitting in Billy's truck in the driveway. She heard the gunshot, but thought it might have been a car backfiring. Moments later, she saw Chester run out of the house. He first tried to get back inside through the side door, but it was locked. He then ran toward the truck and reached the passenger side, where Marcia was sitting. The door was unlocked, but just as Chester reached for the handle, Marcia leaned over and locked it. By then, Chester had put his mask back on. He pulled out his gun and fired once at the passenger side door lock. He then noticed that the driver's door was still unlocked and ran around to that side. Marcia quickly reached over and locked that door as well. Chester fired 2 shots at the driver's side door lock, but the door did not open. He stepped back, looked at Marcia through the window, and fired 2 more shots directly at the driver's side window. The bullets did not strike her. Chester then ran down the street and disappeared. The victims left behind inside the house were traumatized. Aaron and Claire had been raped. Tim had been bound and blindfolded. A 1-year-old baby was still asleep in his crib. Billy Ryman lay dead on the kitchen floor. Marcia Sharp remained in the truck, shocked and frightened but physically unharmed. The night was over, but Chester had escaped into the darkness. After Chester ran away from the house on February 6, 1998, the victims inside were left in shock. Claire got up and locked the side door, preventing Chester from getting back into the house. Aaron and Claire were still naked, blindfolded, and deeply traumatized. Tim remained bound with duct tape in another room. Billy Ryman lay dead on the kitchen floor, while Marcia Sharp sat frightened, but unharmed in the truck parked in the driveway. The police were called immediately. Officers arrived at the scene and found Billy's body, the duct tape, the stolen jewelry, and the victims who had been raped and bound. They began their investigation that same night, collecting evidence from throughout the house, including the duct tape, and obtaining DNA samples from the victims. Investigators also discovered that the telephone lines had been cut, a clear indication that the intruder had carefully planned his entry. Police quickly realized that this crime was connected to a series of burglaries, shootings, and murders that had taken place across Port Arthur over the previous several months. Investigators had already identified a pattern in many of those crimes. The offender consistently cut telephone lines, wore a mask, used a gun, and targeted occupied homes. Although police already had information about a suspect who fit that pattern, they still lacked enough evidence to make an arrest. Soon after the crime, Port Arthur police arrested Chester and took him into custody. While he was being held, investigators requested a blood sample, and Chester agreed to provide one. He then spoke with investigator Timothy Smith. Chester knew Smith and appeared to trust him more than the other officers. He told Smith that he would lead investigators to the gun used to murder Billy Ryman. Smith, 2 investigators from the district attorney's office, and 2 local detectives agreed to accompany him, and they all drove to Chester's father's house. At the time, Chester was wearing a jail jumpsuit. Leg restraints were attached by a chain to another chain around his waist, and that waist chain was connected to his handcuffs. His wrists were shackled to his waist, limiting his movement. Before entering the house, Smith warned Chester that he would not be allowed to touch or handle the gun. Chester insisted that he would need to find it himself because it was hidden in a place that was difficult to reach. He also assured Smith that the gun was unloaded, but that statement was false. Once they arrived at his father's house, Chester moved ahead of the officers as much as his restraints allowed and led them to his bedroom. He slid a small nightstand beneath a hole in the ceiling and started to climb onto it. The officers immediately told him to stop. Instead, investigator Rose climbed up and looked through the opening. Chester directed Rose to search in one particular direction. Rose searched where Chester indicated, but could not find the gun. Then, even while Rose was still standing there, Chester climbed onto the nightstand himself. As he continued directing Rose to look in the same direction, Chester quietly reached with his shackled hands toward the opposite side, where the gun was actually hidden. Investigator Smith had been watching him closely the entire time. When Smith saw Chester reaching in the opposite direction, he drew his own weapon and ordered Chester to stop moving and get down immediately. The officers removed Chester from the nightstand and instructed him to sit on a couch. Smith then climbed up himself and searched the area Chester had secretly reached toward. He found the gun almost immediately and retrieved it. The weapon was fully loaded. This revealed that Chester had lied when he claimed it was unloaded and had apparently tried to grab it so he could use it against the officers. With the gun recovered, investigators now had powerful physical evidence. Ballistics testing matched the weapon to the bullets that had killed Billy Ryman. It was also linked to the murders of John Cepeda, Cheryl DeLeon, Etta Stallings, and Albert Bolden. DNA evidence collected from the duct tape and other items inside the Ryman home matched Chester's DNA. The evidence clearly connected him to all 5 murders, as well as to the rapes of Aaron and Claire. While in custody, Chester confessed to the murder of Billy Ryman. He also admitted killing John Cepeda, Etta Stallings, Cheryl DeLeon, and Albert Bolden. In addition, he confessed to the rapes and the shootings. He explained that he had killed Albert Bolden because Bolden had beaten Chester's sister and had arranged a date for him with a transvestite. Chester also described the methods he routinely used during his crimes, including cutting telephone lines, wearing masks, and using a stolen gun. He further admitted that he had burglarized at least 25 homes during that period. According to Chester, he committed these crimes because he was filled with hatred toward white people, a feeling he said began after a disagreement with a white prison staff member. On February 12, 1998, just 6 days after Billy Ryman's murder, Chester was indicted for capital murder. Capital murder means the killing occurred during the commission of another serious crime, in this case burglary and rape. The case proceeded to trial, where Chester chose to plead guilty to the charge of capital murder. By pleading guilty, he admitted that he had killed Billy Ryman. Because of that plea, the jury did not have to determine his guilt. Instead, its only responsibility was to decide his punishment. Under Texas law, when a defendant pleads guilty to capital murder, A jury must determine whether the sentence will be death or life imprisonment. The punishment phase of the trial then began. Jurors heard detailed evidence about the rapes of Aaron and Claire, the additional murders, and the careful planning that went into each crime. They learned about the gun, the masks, the cut telephone lines, and the false statements Chester had made to investigators. Against the advice of his own attorneys, Chester chose to testify. Speaking directly to the jury, he said he had a whole lot of fun burglarizing homes. He also said he wanted to kill white folks and wished he had killed even more people. Referring to Aaron and Claire DeLeon, he stated that they were lucky they ain't dead. Chester also threatened the jury. He said that if they sentenced him to death, he would order his homeboys to kill a Port Arthur police officer. He added that if they sentenced him to life in prison instead, he would kill a prison guard. His statements shocked the courtroom and demonstrated no remorse. After hearing Chester's testimony and reviewing all of the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. They reached a decision very quickly. After only 11.5 minutes, they returned with their verdict, sentencing Elroy Chester to death. On August 24, 1998, the trial court formally imposed the death sentence, and Chester was sent to Texas death row. Following his sentencing, Chester's attorneys began the appeals process, a lengthy and complex legal procedure. On direct appeal, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed both his conviction and his death sentence on January 26, 2000. Chester then filed a state habeas corpus petition, which is a request for a court to review the legality of a person's imprisonment. That petition was denied on May 31, 2000. He next filed a federal habeas petition on May 22, 2001. In 2002, the United States Supreme Court decided Atkins versus Virginia, ruling that executing mentally retarded individuals was unconstitutional. Chester's attorneys argued that he was mentally retarded and therefore could not legally be executed. A federal district court agreed and granted him relief on July 2, 2002, setting aside his death sentence. However, the state of Texas appealed that ruling. On February 26, 2003, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the district court's decision and reinstated Chester's death sentence. His attorneys continued their legal efforts. Chester filed a second state habeas petition on June 19, 2003, but it was denied on February 28, 2007. He then filed a second federal habeas petition on March 1, 2007, which was denied on April 28, 2008. The Fifth Circuit affirmed that denial on December 30, 2011, and on October 29, 2012, the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. At that point, all of Chester's appeals had been exhausted, and he had no remaining legal options. On December 11, 2012, the trial court scheduled Chester's execution for April 24, 2013. That date was later changed. On April 15, 2013, the court withdrew the original date and rescheduled the execution for June 12, 2013. During the weeks leading up to the execution, Chester's attorneys made one final attempt to stop it. They filed a motion to recall the mandate, a motion to recuse Judge Edith Jones, and a motion requesting a stay of execution. They argued that Judge Jones, who had served on the appellate panel that upheld Chester's death sentence, had demonstrated bias against him through public remarks she had made during a lecture. A new panel of judges reviewed those motions, found no injustice, and denied every request. On June 12, 2013, the United States Supreme Court also rejected Chester's final appeal. On the evening of June 12, 2013, Elroy Chester was taken into the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. He was 43 years old and had spent nearly 15 years on death row. Members of Billy Ryman's family watched the execution from a viewing room. A group of firefighters and police officers from Port Arthur also traveled to Huntsville in support of Billy Ryman, who had served as a firefighter. Chester was served the standard meal provided to all inmates that day because Texas no longer offered special last meals. He was strapped to a gurney while the execution team prepared the lethal injection. Before the procedure began, Chester was given an opportunity to make a final statement. Addressing Billy Ryman's family in the viewing room, he said, "I just want to say I don't want you to have hate in your heart for me, because I took your loved one. I know it doesn't mean anything. I told the truth because I feel like you should know who killed your loved one. God watches everything. Don't hate me. I'm sorry for taking your loved one." He then added, "Elroy Chester wasn't a bad man, I knew me. A lot of people say I didn't commit those murders. I really did it. That's my statement, Warden. You can go ahead." The warden gave the order to proceed, and the lethal injection of pentobarbital was administered. Chester began breathing heavily and yawned before losing consciousness. He was pronounced dead at 7:04 p.m. Central Daylight Time. After the execution, members of Billy Ryman's family spoke publicly. Kim Chason, Billy's sister and the mother of Aaron and Claire, said that justice had been served and that Chester's reign of terror was over. She said she would not claim that the execution brought closure, but she thanked everyone for their support. Billy's brother, Barry Ryman, said the family did not have complete closure because Billy was still gone, and their mother had died before she could witness the execution. He said the execution was for both his mother and Billy, and that it was finally finished. The story of Elroy Chester, his crimes, and his punishment came to a definitive end that night. Story 3. William Edward Van Poyck was born on July 4, 1954, in Florida. His mother passed away when he was only about 18 months old, meaning William grew up without the care of his biological mother from a very young age. His father, Walter Van Poyck, was a good man, but he was often away from home. During World War II, Walter had lost his leg while fighting in the Holland invasion. Because of his injury and the demands of his job, he was not always able to be present with his children. Walter worked as an executive for Eastern Airlines, a position that required frequent travel and kept him away from home for long periods of time. After William's mother died, Walter hired a woman named Ms. Dano to take care of the house and the children. William had an older brother named Jeffrey and a sister named Lisa. However, Ms. Dano was a strict disciplinarian who regularly beat the 3 children. The abuse became so severe that Walter eventually fired her. He had to pull a gun on her to force her to leave the house. After Ms. Dano was gone, a woman the children called Aunt Phyllis came to live with them and take care of them. However, Aunt Phyllis was not a stable person. She told the children that she was their real mother, even though this was not true. Her real name may have been something else, and she had changed it to Phyllis. William's stepmother later described Aunt Phyllis as an unstable woman. The children remained under her care for a period of time. Later, Walter married a woman named Lee Hightower, who became William's stepmother. She tried to provide care and stability for the children, but the family situation remained difficult. William's older brother Jeffrey had a major influence on him. Jeffrey was already involved in criminal activity and later claimed that he had committed more than 500 burglaries before his first arrest. He was described as a cold and troubling person, and although he became a role model for William, he was not a positive one. Jeffrey introduced William to crime and alcohol at a young age. When William was 12 years old, he was sent to a youth detention center for the first time. Shortly after arriving there, he was raped by older inmates. This experience became a traumatic event in his life. 2 years later, when William was 14, he was sent to the Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee. The facility was known for its harsh conditions. While at Okeechobee, William experienced severe physical abuse. He was hogtied, meaning his hands and feet were bound together. He was drenched in water and left overnight in a room known as the wet room. He was also frequently sent to a room called the ice cream room, where he received 30 lashes with straps and paddles. If he cried out during the beatings, the punishment was repeated. William also witnessed other children being sexually abused. The facility was overcrowded and dangerous, and smaller and younger children were placed alongside violent offenders, creating an environment where physical and sexual assaults happened constantly. William's early experiences in these institutions affected him deeply. He continued to get into trouble with the law and eventually built a long criminal record. In 1971, he was convicted of several crimes, including robbery with a deadly weapon, burglary, grand theft, and trafficking in stolen property. For the robbery charge, he was sentenced to life in prison. He also received additional sentences for the burglary and theft charges. As a young adult, he spent many years inside the Florida prison system. While serving time in adult prison, William suffered a mental breakdown. For much of the following several years, he received psychiatric treatment and medication, including strong antipsychotic drugs. He was admitted to the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee on 2 separate occasions for mental health care. Doctors diagnosed him with a personality disorder and other issues. However, at some point, William admitted to his lawyer that he had faked some aspects of his mental illness. He explained that he had gone to the prison library and studied books about schizophrenia and mental disorders. He carefully prepared himself to convince doctors that he was mentally ill. For example, he made it appear as though he was chewing on a light bulb by placing something in his mouth that created a crunching sound before spitting out metal pieces. The doctors believed his behavior and sent him to the hospital. However, William's mental health history was complicated. Some doctors later found that he did not show signs of psychosis during certain periods, while other records showed that he experienced periods of serious mental disturbance. Despite his struggles, William was an intelligent person. He became very knowledgeable about the law and spent time in prison reading and studying legal procedures. He used this knowledge to help himself and others with legal matters. He also maintained contact with his family, especially his sister Lisa and his brother Jeffrey. While in prison, William formed a close friendship with another inmate named James O'Brien. The 2 men served time together and became good friends. Over the years they spent within the prison system, they developed a strong bond. William was released from prison at different points in his life. He was incarcerated from 1972 to 1978, and then again from 1978 to 1986. In 1979, he was convicted of escape and received an additional sentence. Eventually, he was released on parole. At the time of the events that would come later, William was on parole and living outside of prison. He had spent most of his adult life behind bars, but he was now attempting to live in the free world. However, his connections to his former friends and his criminal past remained strong. His friendship with James O'Brien continued even after they were both released from prison or placed in different facilities. William also stayed in contact with his brother Jeffrey, who was still serving a long prison sentence for armed robbery. Throughout his early life, William showed signs of both intelligence and instability. He experienced abuse, loss, and trauma from a very young age. He moved in and out of juvenile facilities and adult prisons for most of his life. He developed a long record of violent and property crimes. He was also diagnosed with mental health issues, although he later claimed that he had faked some of those conditions. His family relationships were complicated. His father was often absent, his mother had died, his brother was a negative influence, and many of the caretakers in his life were abusive or unstable. These experiences shaped him into someone who was familiar with violence, prison, and planning criminal acts. At the same time, he was deeply loyal to the people close to him, especially James O'Brien, who had become like a brother to him during their years in prison. By 1987, William Van Poyck was 32 years old. He had a long criminal history behind him. He was on parole. He was intelligent and understood the law well. And he remained close to James O'Brien, who was still in prison at that time. O'Brien had a medical appointment scheduled for June 24, 1987. He needed to visit a dermatologist in West Palm Beach for an examination related to skin cancer. Because O'Brien was an inmate, prison guards were responsible for transporting him to the appointment. The night before the scheduled visit, O'Brien contacted Van Poyck. He provided him with details about the transport, including when and where the prison van would be. Van Poyck saw this information as an opportunity to help his friend escape from custody. Van Poyck began planning the escape attempt, but he knew he could not carry it out alone. He recruited another man named Frank Valdez to assist him. Valdez agreed to participate in the plan. Together, they prepared for the ambush and gathered weapons they intended to use during the crime. They brought 3 handguns with them. One was a Hungarian Interarms 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Another was a Sig Sauer 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The third was a Starpoint .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. They placed the guns inside a Cadillac that they planned to use as their getaway vehicle. They drove the Cadillac to an area near the doctor's office and waited for the prison van to arrive. On the morning of June 24, 1987, the prison van left Glades Correctional Institution. Inside the vehicle were 3 people. Fred Griffiths was the driver. He was a corrections officer and a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. He was not armed. Stephen Turner was the other corrections officer. His responsibility was to watch O'Brien, who was secured inside a caged area behind the driver's seat. Turner was armed with his service revolver. O'Brien was handcuffed and locked inside the cage. The van traveled to the dermatologist's office in West Palm Beach. Griffiths drove the vehicle into an alley behind the doctor's office, which was the location where they normally parked during these types of appointments. After the van stopped, Turner briefly looked down at his paperwork. When Turner looked up again, he saw Van Poyck standing near the van. Van Poyck was pointing a pistol directly at Turner's head. He ordered Turner to get out of the vehicle. At the same time, Valdez moved to the driver's side of the van, where Griffiths was sitting. Turner was forced to exit the vehicle. Van Poyck took Turner's service revolver away from him and ordered him to crawl underneath the van. Turner attempted to follow the order, but Van Poyck kicked him while he was moving underneath the vehicle. Turner ended up lying on the ground beneath the van, where he could no longer see everything happening around him. From underneath the vehicle, Turner could see only the feet of the people near the van. He saw Griffiths get out of the driver's side. He also saw Valdez forcing Griffiths toward the back of the van. Griffiths realized that the 2 men were attempting to release O'Brien from the cage. Griffiths decided to try to stop them. He took the keys to the van and threw them into nearby bushes. This meant that Van Poyck and Valdez could not unlock the van doors or open the cage to free O'Brien. Griffiths refused to tell them where he had thrown the keys. This act of resistance led to violence. While Turner was still underneath the van, he heard gunshots coming from the rear of the vehicle. He saw Griffiths fall to the ground. Griffiths had been shot 3 times. 2 bullets struck his chest, and 1 bullet struck his head. The shot to Griffiths's head was fired from extremely close range. The barrel of the gun had been placed against his head when the trigger was pulled. Each of the 3 gunshot wounds was fatal on its own. Griffiths died at the scene. The weapon used to kill him was later identified as the Hungarian Interarms 9mm semi-automatic pistol. After Griffiths was shot, Van Poyck and Valdez continued their attempt to free O'Brien. Turner was still beneath the van. They forced him to get up and search for the keys that Griffiths had thrown. Turner did not know where the keys were because he had been underneath the vehicle and had not seen where Griffiths threw them. When Turner was unable to locate the keys, Valdez began shooting at the padlock securing the van door. He fired several shots at the lock. However, one of the bullets missed the padlock and instead ricocheted off the metal surface of the van. The bullet struck Turner, causing minor injuries, but he was not seriously wounded. After firing at the padlock, Valdez began smashing one of the windows of the van. Van Poyck still had the Hungarian interarms pistol in his hand. He pointed it at Turner and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked, but it did not fire. No bullet was released. Turner survived because the weapon misfired. At that moment, 2 cars entered the alley. The drivers had not expected to encounter an active ambush. Van Poyck shifted his attention away from Turner and walked toward one of the vehicles. He used the butt of his gun to smash the windshield. This was an act of intimidation meant to stop anyone from interfering. Turner used this opportunity to run away from the scene and escape from the attackers. Van Poyck and Valdez realized that the escape attempt had failed. O'Brien was still locked inside the van, and they were unable to get him out. They decided to flee. They ran to the Cadillac they had parked in a nearby lot, got inside, and drove away from the alley. By that time, a police officer had arrived at the scene. The officer saw the 2 men leaving the alley in the Cadillac. He immediately radioed for assistance and began pursuing them. The police chase then began. The Cadillac traveled through the streets of West Palm Beach with Van Poyck in the passenger seat and Valdez driving. As police vehicles followed them, Van Poyck leaned out of the window and fired his gun repeatedly at the pursuing officers. His shots struck 3 police vehicles. The officers inside those vehicles were placed in danger, but none of them were hit. The pursuit continued along Palm Beach Lakes Boulevard before the Cadillac turned south onto Australian Avenue. Valdez continued driving at a high speed in an attempt to escape. Near the Palm Beach airport, he lost control of the vehicle. The Cadillac struck a tree and crashed. The car was disabled and could not continue. Police surrounded the crashed vehicle and took Van Poyck and Valdez into custody. During a search of the Cadillac, officers found 4 handguns inside. 3 of them were the weapons Van Poyck and Valdez had brought with them: the Hungarian interarms 9mm, the Sig Sauer 9mm, and the Star Point .22 caliber. The 4th gun was the service revolver that Van Poyck had taken from Officer Turner at the beginning of the ambush. Police also found evidence connecting the murder weapon to the shooting of Fred Griffiths. Van Poyck had planned the operation, recruited Valdez, and directly participated in the ambush. He had carried loaded weapons and fired at police officers during the chase. The crime ended with a dead guard, an injured guard, a failed escape attempt, and 2 men in police custody. After the crash and the arrest, police immediately began their investigation. They had recovered the 4 handguns from the Cadillac, along with the testimony of Officer Stephen Turner, who had survived the attack. Turner was able to identify Van Poyck as the man who had pointed a gun at his head and taken his service revolver. He could also explain what he had seen while lying underneath the van during the ambush. Investigators also had the murder weapon. Ballistics experts examined the Hungarian interarms 9mm pistol and matched the bullets recovered from Fred Griffiths' body to that specific firearm. This directly connected the weapon to the shooting. Police also examined the bullet that had ricocheted and struck Turner, and that bullet was also determined to have come from the same gun. The evidence against Van Poyck and Valdez was strong. Both men were charged with multiple crimes. The legal process moved forward, and Van Poyck was formally indicted on July 14, 1987. The charges against him included first-degree murder, armed robbery, attempted manslaughter, aggravated assault, and aiding the escape of an inmate. The prosecution also added a charge of attempted first-degree murder for the shooting involving Officer Turner. The case went to trial. During the guilt phase, the jury heard the evidence presented by both sides. They listened to Officer Turner's testimony, examined the firearms, and reviewed the ballistic reports. They also heard Van Poyck testify in his own defense. Van Poyck admitted that he had planned the operation and recruited Valdez. He admitted that the two of them had brought 3 guns with them. However, he denied shooting Griffiths. Van Poyck claimed that he was kicking Turner when he heard the gunshots and saw Griffiths fall to the ground. The jury did not accept this defense. On November 15, 1988, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. They found Van Poyck guilty of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and all of the other charges. After the guilt phase ended, the trial moved into the penalty phase. This was the stage where the jury decided whether to recommend the death penalty or life in prison. The prosecution presented evidence about Van Poyck's criminal history. They showed that he was on parole at the time of the crime and presented his previous convictions for robbery and other violent felonies. The defense attempted to show another side of Van Poyck's life. His brother Jeffrey testified about their difficult childhood. His aunt and stepmother also spoke about the problems within the family. A nurse from the jail testified that Van Poyck could be caring and helpful toward other inmates. Van Poyck himself testified and expressed remorse for what had happened. After considering the evidence, the jury deliberated on the appropriate punishment. By a vote of 11-1, they recommended that Van Poyck receive the death penalty. The final decision was made by trial judge Michael D. Miller. He followed the jury's recommendation. On December 21, 1988, he sentenced William Van Poyck to death for the first-degree murder of Fred Griffiths. The judge also imposed additional sentences for the remaining charges. For armed robbery, Van Poyck received life in prison. For the 6 counts of attempted manslaughter, he received 15 years for each count. For aggravated assault, he received 5 years. For aiding the escape of an inmate, he received 15 years. For the attempted first-degree murder of Officer Turner, he received another life sentence. The judge ordered that all of these sentences run consecutively, meaning they would be served one after another. The appeals process began immediately. Van Poyck appealed his convictions and death sentence to the Florida Supreme Court. On July 5, 1990, the court affirmed both his convictions and the death sentence. The court agreed that there was sufficient evidence to support felony murder, even though it found insufficient evidence for premeditated murder. The court also rejected his claims involving ineffective trial counsel and other legal issues. Van Poyck then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, but that court denied his petition on March 18, 1991. Over the next 2 decades, Van Poyck continued filing appeals. He submitted motions for post-conviction relief, habeas corpus petitions in state and federal courts, and other legal challenges. He argued that his lawyer had not provided effective representation during the penalty phase. He claimed that the prosecution had withheld evidence. He argued that the aggravating factors used against him were invalid. He also claimed that Valdez had actually fired the fatal shots, and that the jury should have known this information. Courts at every level reviewed his arguments. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his appeals multiple times, including decisions in 1997, 1998, and later years. Federal courts also rejected his habeas corpus petitions in 1999 and 2002. The United States Supreme Court denied his requests for review each time. While Van Poyck remained on death row, significant events occurred involving his accomplice. Frank Valdez was also sentenced to death for his role in the murder of Fred Griffiths. However, Valdez never reached execution. In 1999, Valdez was killed inside the prison. He was beaten to death by corrections officers during a violent cell extraction. 7 guards were charged in connection with his death, but none were convicted. Later, the state of Florida paid Valdez's family more than $700,000 to settle a civil lawsuit. After Valdez's death, Van Poyck was transferred to a prison in Virginia for his own safety. During his years on death row, Van Poyck changed in many ways. He became a writer and wrote a 324-page autobiography titled A Checkered Past, a memoir. He said his purpose was to show a human side of himself and of convicted criminals in general. He also wrote 2 novels and won awards for his writing. Van Poyck maintained a blog by writing letters to his sister Lisa, who posted them online. In his writings, he expressed remorse for the death of Fred Griffiths. He said that he was guilty of attempting to break someone out of a prison transport van, but he claimed that he never intended to hurt anyone. Despite his claim that he did not fire the fatal shot, the courts held him responsible under the law of felony murder. His many legal appeals continued to fail. On June 12, 2013, the date of his execution arrived. Van Poyck was 58 years old. He had spent most of his adult life in prison. On the morning of his execution, he was given a final meal of oatmeal and eggs at 5 a.m. He declined to request a special last meal. At 7:24 p.m., the execution began. William Van Poyck was put to death by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark. His final words were, "Set me free." He was pronounced dead 23 minutes after the injection process began. His sister Lisa stood outside the prison with other supporters. She said that he was finally free from those prison walls. The family of Fred Griffiths had waited for justice for almost 3 decades. They attended nearly every court proceeding throughout the years. Griffiths' brother Ronald said that the murder had ripped a hole in the family's heart that never truly healed. The family continued to believe in the judicial system, even though the process had been slow. Officer Stephen Turner, the guard who survived the attack, spoke after the execution. He said that justice had prevailed and that they could now close the book. Van Poyck's execution brought an end to the long legal process. He became the 77th person executed in Florida since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. William Van Poyck died for the murder of Fred Griffiths, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had thrown away the keys in an attempt to prevent a prisoner from escaping. Story 4. James Louis DeRosa was born on March 17, 1977, in Irving, Texas. His mother was Cassie DeRosa, and his father was James Money. At the time of his birth, his family included his mother, his father, and his older half-brother Jason. Jason had a different father than James. When James was only a few weeks old, his father stole about $1,500 from his employer and fled to San Francisco. He returned about 4 months later, but the marriage was already broken. Cassie came home one day and found Money on the couch with another man. She moved out of the house with her 2 sons and tried to raise them by herself. Cassie's relationship with her own mother, Connie Nadan Carroll, was very bad. Connie did not help Cassie raise the boys. Connie later told Cassie that she never cared for her because she was defective. Connie also believed that James was defective because he looked like his mother. Connie showed favoritism toward Jason, the older brother, but did not care for James in the same way. On November 28, 1978, Cassie enlisted in the military. She filed for divorce from Money later that same day. She enlisted first because the military would not allow a single mother to join. After she enlisted, she left for basic training in December 1978. She asked her mother Connie to take care of the boys. Connie agreed to take Jason but refused to take James. Cassie had to leave James with a roommate instead. Later, Cassie was selected to attend a drill sergeant academy at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Her mother refused to take the boys again, saying it was too expensive. Instead, Cassie found a daycare center in Lawton, Oklahoma, that was specifically for military parents. She placed both boys there and left for training. When Cassie returned about 2.5 weeks later, she discovered that her mother had taken the boys from the daycare center. Connie claimed that Cassie had abandoned them. Cassie had left a letter with the daycare director forbidding them from releasing the boys to Connie, but Connie forged a document to get custody. Connie also obtained restraining orders that prevented Cassie from having contact with her sons. On one occasion, when Cassie tried to visit her boys, Connie chased her away in a car and threatened to kill her. About 2 months after Connie took the boys, she sent James to Boston to live with his father, James Money. James was around 3 or 4 years old at this time. He lived with Money for several years. During this time, James was often neglected. His father was not around much. James lived with his father and a woman named Vicky, whom Money later married. Vicky was physically abusive toward James. She would whip him for wetting the bed. She also abused him in other ways. James's half-sister Marlene Sharp lived with them for a period of time. Marlene was about 11 years older than James. She testified that James would get beaten for wetting the bed. Plates and dishes were thrown at him. He would also take the blame and the punishment for the misbehavior of Timothy, the son of Vicky and Money. Marlene also stated that her father sexually abused her, and she had to leave the home. James also had problems with soiling himself, which is called encapricis. His school became concerned that his problems could be a sign of sexual abuse. The school pulled James and Timothy out of class and interviewed them about their home life. The state was called in to investigate the family. James and Timothy were taken away from the home for a short time, but the concerns were eventually found to be unfounded, and the children were returned. When James was about 6 years old, Money and Vicky moved back to Dallas. James continued to live with them. His bedwetting continued, and so did the punishment. Marlene, his half-sister, continued to see James occasionally. She could see that he was always worried and depressed. She tried to protect him when she could. Marlene also testified that James did not know who his real mother was for a long time. He did not know that Cassie was his mother. When he was around 9 or 10 years old, Money decided to go on the road as a truck driver. Marlene was scared for James to stay alone with Vicky because Vicky was abusive. Marlene asked Money not to leave James with Vicky. Money told her that Cassie had asked to have custody of James again. Marlene begged her father to allow James to move in with Cassie. Money agreed. In 1985, Cassie married a man named James DeRosa Sr. She took her new husband's last name. In 1987, Jason went to live with Cassie. In April 1988, James joined them. James was 11 years old at that time. He finally met his mother again and learned who she was. He also took the last name DeRosa. In August 1988, the family moved to Germany because Cassie's husband was in the military. While in Germany, James began to display inappropriate behaviors. His behavior became so serious that he had to be sent back to Arkansas and admitted to a hospital psychiatric unit. He was diagnosed with concentration hyperactivity disorder and severe depression. He was also depressed about the physical and mental abuse he had suffered. There were suspicions that he had been sexually molested by his father Money. Cassie later testified that James had a very difficult time even as a teenager. She said that he would sometimes stand in the middle of a room and scream. She would hold him in a rocking chair, and he would ask her to make the pain go away. Cassie herself also suffered from depression and had problems with alcohol. She eventually received psychological treatment. After James was discharged from the psychiatric hospital, he attended high school in Oklahoma. He was smart but bored with school. His grades were poor. His track coach, Stan Stone, remembered that James was an excellent runner. In fact, in 1995, James won the Oklahoma State Championship in the 3,200-meter run. But Coach Stone could also tell that James was a troubled kid. He seemed to have been abused and neglected. Coach Stone also observed that James's mother was very aggressive and intolerant. She pushed him without mercy. She seemed very unstable. Virginia Poe, James's high school counselor, also noticed that his mother was very difficult to work with. She was more strict with him than most other parents. Poe believed that James was a very unhappy child. James graduated from high school in 1995. After graduation, he joined the army. His time in the military did not go well. He received a bad conduct discharge for stealing a car. He was sentenced to 10 months in a military correctional facility at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. After completing his sentence, James returned to Poteau, Oklahoma. He lived with his mother for a time. He worked a series of low-paying jobs in restaurants and retail stores. He did not have a stable career. He did not have a stable home life. He moved from place to place. At one point, he rented a room from a man named Chris Ford. At another point, he met two young men named Eric Castleberry and Scotty White. They became acquaintances. In the summer of 1999, James's mother Cassie began working for an elderly couple named Curtis and Gloria Plummer. The Plummers lived on a ranch in rural Poteau. Cassie helped maintain their houses, lawns, and equipment. In August 1999, Cassie had to leave for a 30-day training session with the Army Reserves. The Plumbers agreed to allow James to fill in for her while she was gone. So James worked on the Plummer ranch for about a month. He did various tasks around the property. The Plumbers paid him for his work. They treated him decently. They allowed him to work as a favor to his mother. Janet Tolbert, the Plummer's daughter, testified that while James was working on the ranch, her father would ask her to check on James and make sure he had plenty of water. After that summer, James did not continue working for the Plumbers. He went back to his low-paying jobs and his unstable life. He drifted from place to place. He did not have a steady girlfriend or a clear plan for the future. He talked about moving to Corpus Christi, Texas, to find better work. But he did not have money to make that move. He was struggling financially. In early 2000, James was renting a room from Chris Ford. During March or April of that year, James spoke to Ford about the elderly couple he had worked for the previous summer. He told Ford that the couple would be an easy target. He said that when the man would pay him, he would just pull out his wallet, which had big bills in it, and pay him in cash. James asked Ford to drop him off at the Plummer's house so that he could go in and rob them. He said he planned to go in while they were asleep, gag them, tape them up, and then leave with some money and take their vehicle. Ford did not agree to help. James did not stop thinking about this idea. He continued to believe that the Plumbers had a lot of cash in their home and that they would be easy targets. He also believed that he would not be caught. But at this point, he had not yet taken any action. He was still just talking about it to different people. On September 30th, 2000, James was hanging out in a bowling alley parking lot with Eric Castleberry and Scotty White. The three of them were just spending time together. James brought up the idea of robbing the Plumbers. He asked Scotty White if he would go with him to the house and help him rob the owners. White declined. Then James asked Eric Castleberry. Castleberry agreed. James told them that the people always carried a bunch of money on them. He said they would be easy to rob. Castleberry later testified that he and James needed money in order to move to Corpus Christi to find work. James spoke to Castleberry again the next day, and Castleberry again agreed to go into the house with him. They talked about using guns, but they were unable to get guns, so they decided to use knives instead. At this point, James had a plan in his mind. He had chosen the victims. He had recruited a partner to help him. He had decided on the method, but the actual robbery had not yet happened. The events of that night were still 2 days away. On Monday, October 2nd, 2000, James DeRosa, Eric Castleberry, and Scotty White were driving back to Poteau from Fort Smith, Arkansas. They had been visiting a friend who was in the hospital. During this drive, DeRosa told the other two men that they were going to do it that night. They all agreed on a plan. White would drop DeRosa and Castleberry off at the Plummer's house. DeRosa and Castleberry would go inside and rob the couple. They would steal the Plummer's old truck and drive it to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain. White would meet them there. Then they would abandon the truck and leave the area. Before they could carry out the plan, they had to make a stop. They attempted to track down Mavis Smith, who was a sister of the friend they had visited in the hospital. While they were doing this, a highway patrol trooper pulled them over for speeding. The trooper stopped both Castleberry and Smith at around 7:10 that evening. DeRosa and White were in Castleberry's car at the time. The traffic stop did not lead to any arrests. The men were allowed to go on their way. After the traffic stop, the three men went to their respective homes to prepare for the robbery. DeRosa went to his home and got a white batting glove or golf glove. He could only find one glove, so he also got a sock to wear on his other hand. He considered taking his mother's gun, but he decided against it. The gun was registered in her name, and he did not want it to be traced back to him. Castleberry already had 2 knives in his car, so they decided to use those knives instead of guns. One knife was a green-handled knife, about 12 to 14 inches long. The other knife was a lock-blade buck knife, about 8 to 9 inches long when the blade was open. Castleberry took the green-handled knife. DeRosa took the buck knife. Castleberry also had thick black rubberized gloves in his car, which he put on. DeRosa gave White directions to the Plummer home. White was now driving Castleberry's car. They arrived at the Plummer home at approximately 9 p.m. DeRosa told White to check back in about 10 to 15 minutes. This was to make sure that no one else was in the home. If someone else was there, they might have aborted the plan. White dropped DeRosa and Castleberry off and drove away. About 10 to 15 minutes later, White drove past the Plummer home again. He saw lights on throughout the house. He did not see any sign of his friends. He assumed everything was proceeding, so he drove on to Sugarloaf Mountain to wait for them. Meanwhile, DeRosa and Castleberry walked up to the front door of the Plummer home. They were not wearing masks or disguises of any kind. DeRosa knew that the Plumbers would recognize him. He was counting on that recognition to gain entry. He rang the doorbell. Gloria Plummer answered the door. DeRosa told her that he wanted to talk to her husband about possible work opportunities. This was a lie. The real purpose was to get inside the house so they could rob the couple. Gloria let them in. She took them to the den, where her husband Curtis was watching Monday Night Football on television. DeRosa and Castleberry sat and chatted with the Plumbers in the den for a few minutes. They made small talk. They pretended to be interested in work. Then DeRosa made his move. He pulled out his buck knife. He put the knife to Curtis Plummer's neck and told him to sit still. At the same time, Gloria Plummer grabbed the cordless phone and tried to dial for help. Castleberry reacted quickly. He yanked the base of the cordless phone out of the wall. This disconnected the phone so Gloria could not make a call. Castleberry then pulled out his green-handled knife. He held it to Gloria's neck and told her to sit still as well. With both victims under control, DeRosa stayed in the den with the Plumbers while Castleberry began searching the bedrooms. Castleberry was looking for money and other valuables. He went through the rooms, opening drawers and looking for anything worth stealing. While Castleberry was in the second bedroom, he heard DeRosa yell for him to come back and help. Castleberry ran back to the den. When he arrived, he saw that DeRosa was now standing near the door to the kitchen. DeRosa was struggling with the Plumbers. The couple was fighting back and resisting. Castleberry saw DeRosa stabbing at both of them. He saw blood all over Gloria Plummer. The medical examiner later documented all of the wounds that the Plumbers suffered. Gloria Plummer had 5 stab wounds to her back. One of those wounds entered her left lung. Another wound went into her liver. Both of those wounds could have been fatal over time. She also had a stab wound in her upper chest area. That wound passed into her left lung and also cut her aorta. That wound would have been fatal within 3 to 5 minutes. She had an incised wound on her left forearm, which was likely a defensive wound. She had a similar wound on the left side of her chin. These wounds were inflicted by DeRosa. Curtis Plummer also suffered serious wounds. He had 2 stab wounds on his front side. One was in his abdominal area. The other was near his right collarbone. He also had superficial wounds on the upper left side of his chest. Castleberry also saw DeRosa stab Curtis in the chest. At this point, both victims were bleeding heavily and were in great pain. Castleberry then went up behind Gloria Plummer. He put his knife to her throat and slit her throat. He pulled her backwards and threw her down onto a love seat. Gloria had 2 significant wounds to her neck and throat area. One was a long wound on the bottom left side of her chin, extending down onto her neck. The shape of this wound indicated that there was movement going on between the knife and the victim. That wound would have been fatal over time. The other wound was a jagged and complex wound on the right side of her neck, about 4 inches long. This wound cut through her windpipe and also cut her right carotid artery and jugular vein. The jagged edges of the wound showed that it was not a single cut. It was made by multiple passes or a sawing action with the knife. Castleberry then stabbed Curtis Plummer a couple of times in the back. Curtis had 4 stab wounds on his back. One of those wounds passed into his left lung and caused a significant amount of blood loss into his chest cavity. Another wound passed into his right lung. Both of these wounds would likely have been fatal over time, but not immediately. DeRosa then pushed Curtis back toward the love seat and the television. Despite his injuries, Curtis Plummer was still alive and conscious. He picked up the cordless phone, which was on the floor. He begged the 2 men to let him call an ambulance for his wife. He told them that he would give them anything they wanted if they would just let him get help for his wife. DeRosa did not agree to this request. Instead, he picked up a marble-topped end table and threw it at Curtis. The table hit Curtis on the head. The force of the blow caused Curtis to fall to the ground. DeRosa then walked over to where Curtis was lying on the floor. He bent down and slit Curtis's throat from ear to ear. He left him lying on the floor in a pool of blood. The wound on Curtis Plummer's neck was about 7 inches long. It cut through his trachea, his esophagus, and all the major arteries and veins in his neck. The wound went all the way to his spinal column. The jagged edges of the wound showed that it was not a single clean cut. It was made by a repositioning and a sawing type motion. Castleberry then pulled Gloria down off the love seat. He left her face down on the floor, near her husband. Both victims were now dead. After the murders, DeRosa and Castleberry began ransacking the house. They were looking for cash and anything valuable. They went through drawers and closets. They searched the entire home. Despite their extensive search, they only found Curtis Plummer's wallet and Gloria Plummer's purse. DeRosa took the cash out of the wallet. Castleberry dumped the purse onto the laundry room floor and took the cash. The total amount they stole was only $73. They then tried to find the keys for an older white pickup truck that was parked outside. They could not find those keys, so they decided to take a different vehicle. They took the much newer tan Chevrolet pickup truck that was parked in the garage. DeRosa drove the stolen truck to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain. When he got there, he decided not to leave it there. He thought it would be too obvious. The truck would be found too quickly. They met White on their way back down the mountain. DeRosa told White to wait for a few minutes and then meet them at the Poteau City Lake. When DeRosa and Castleberry arrived at the lake, they put the Plummer's truck into the water. They got into the water themselves. They rinsed the blood off their bodies. They changed into fresh clothes that they had left in Castleberry's car. White arrived at the lake and saw the back of the truck and its taillights as the truck sank into the water. DeRosa and Castleberry took their wet, bloody clothing and put it into a black plastic garbage bag. Castleberry threw his gloves and his knife into the lake. DeRosa put his knife into the bloody sock that he had worn on his hand. He threw that into the water as well. The knives were never recovered. After they had disposed of the evidence, the 3 men got back into Castleberry's car. They drove to a Taco Bell restaurant in Poteau. They used the stolen money to buy themselves tacos. They ate the food they had purchased with the blood money. Before dropping White off later that night, Castleberry told White that they had ended up having to kill the plumbers. White also testified that DeRosa told him that he had stabbed the old man in the back and cut his throat. He also said that he had picked up a marble table and thrown it at the old man. DeRosa was worried about leaving fingerprints on that marble table. Later that night, DeRosa and Castleberry went to a campground area. They sprayed lighter fluid on the garbage bag containing their bloody clothes. They set the bag on fire and burned the clothing. They were concerned that DeRosa's combat boots would not burn completely, so they dropped the boots over a bridge near Kyoto Landing. After burning the evidence, Castleberry and DeRosa drove to a friend's house. They told their friend Justin Wingo about what they had done. Castleberry was driving with Wingo in the front passenger seat and DeRosa in the back. Castleberry told Wingo that they had gone to the home of two people, robbed them, stabbed them, slit their throats, taken their money, and stolen their truck. They said they had driven the truck into the lake. Castleberry did most of the talking, but DeRosa agreed with everything and backed it up. DeRosa said that he had killed the old man by hitting him in the head with an end table, slitting his throat, and stabbing him. Wingo thought Castleberry was playing a joke on him at first. He did not take the story seriously. The next morning, October 3rd, 2000, DeRosa and Castleberry left for Corpus Christi, Texas. They drove to the home of Castleberry's father. They planned to stay there and look for work. They thought they had gotten away with the robbery and the murders. They had disposed of the evidence. They had left the state. They believed that no one would connect them to the crime. Back in Poteau, the bodies of Curtis and Gloria Plummer were discovered later that same morning. A man named Roger Murray worked for the Plumbers around the ranch. When they did not answer their door, he became concerned. He contacted their granddaughter Tanya Woodruff, who lived nearby and had a key to the home. They entered the house together and found the bodies lying in pools of blood on the floor. The sight was horrific. The couple had been dead for about 12 hours. At this point, the police did not know who had committed the murders. They began an investigation. They did not yet have any suspects. They did not know where the killers had gone. They were still gathering evidence and trying to piece together what had happened. DeRosa and Castleberry were still in Texas, believing they were safe. The discovery of the bodies happened on the morning of October 3rd, 2000. Roger Murray, who worked on the Plummer Ranch, went to the house because the Plumbers did not answer their door. He contacted their granddaughter Tanya Woodruff, who had a key to the home. When they entered, they found Curtis and Gloria Plummer dead on the floor. The police were called immediately. They began investigating the scene. They found that the house had been ransacked and that a pickup truck was missing. At that time, they did not know who had committed the murders. The next morning, October 4th, 2000, Scotty White went to his high school. He was 18 years old and a senior. He went to a teacher and told them that he knew who had killed the Plumbers. Later that morning, he met with Sheriff Kendall Ballou and investigator Sean Ward in the principal's office. White told them that DeRosa and Castleberry had committed the murders. He explained how they had done it, what they had done with the Plumber's truck, and that they had left for Texas. After this interview, the officers went to the Poteau City Lake. They found the Plumber's pickup truck submerged in the water, exactly where White had said it would be. At first, White tried to minimize his own role. He said that the other men had just told him about what happened. But the investigators were suspicious. White knew too many details. They took him to the district attorney's office for more questioning. Shortly after 1 p.m., after being read his rights, White admitted that he had dropped DeRosa and Castleberry off at the Plummer home. In a third interview, White told them that DeRosa and Castleberry had gone to Corpus Christi, Texas. That same evening, October 4th, 2000, police officers in Corpus Christi arrested DeRosa and Castleberry. They were found outside the home of Castleberry's father. When the arresting officer told DeRosa that he was being arrested for 2 counts of first-degree murder, DeRosa made a statement. He said, "Yeah, I heard about what happened to those people. We had just visited them, so my prints are probably out there." This statement showed that he was already thinking about how to explain away any physical evidence that might connect him to the crime. The next day, Sheriff Ballou and Investigator Ward arrived in Corpus Christi to bring DeRosa and Castleberry back to Oklahoma. Castleberry agreed to talk with them after being read his rights. At first, he denied any involvement, but then he changed his mind. He gave a detailed, tape-recorded confession. His story matched the physical evidence at the crime scene. He admitted that he and DeRosa had planned the robbery and that they had killed the plumbers. Castleberry later pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for his testimony against DeRosa, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Scotty White was also charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But because he had cooperated with the police and had not entered the home, his charges were reduced to 2 counts of being an accessory after the fact to murder. He pled guilty to these charges. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent 25-year prison terms. The last 7 years of his sentence were to be served on supervised probation. DeRosa was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. The prosecution filed a bill of particulars. This document stated that DeRosa should be punished by death because of 2 aggravating circumstances. The first was that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. The second was that the murders were committed for the purpose of avoiding or preventing a lawful arrest or prosecution. 3 attorneys from the Oklahoma Indigent Defense System were appointed to represent DeRosa. While DeRosa was awaiting trial in December 2000, he escaped from the LaFleur County Jail. He and another inmate overpowered a jailer when he entered their cell. They hit the jailer on the head and escaped, but they were captured 6 hours later near a Poteau apartment complex. This escape was not mentioned at his trial, and none of the jurors showed any awareness of it during jury selection. DeRosa's trial began on October 15, 2001. The trial lasted for several days. The prosecution presented its case. They called Eric Castleberry as a witness. Castleberry testified in detail about how the robbery and murders were planned and carried out. They called Scotty White as a witness. White testified about his role as the driver and what he had seen and heard after the murders. They also presented physical evidence, including photographs of the crime scene and testimony from the medical examiner. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury also heard from a jailhouse informant named Daniel Wilson, who shared a cell with DeRosa after his arrest. Wilson testified that DeRosa had bragged about the crimes and said that everything had gone perfectly until White came forward. At the conclusion of the guilt phase, the jury found DeRosa guilty on both counts of first-degree felony murder. The case then moved to the sentencing phase. The prosecution presented victim impact testimony from Janet Tolbert, the plumber's only daughter, and Joe Milligan, Gloria's sister. They spoke about the emotional and psychological effects of the murders on their family. Tolbert asked the jury to sentence DeRosa to death. DeRosa's defense attorneys presented mitigating evidence. They called his mother Cassie, his half-brother Jason, his half-sister Marlene, a psychologist and a neuropsychologist. They testified about his troubled childhood, his mental health issues, and the abuse and abandonment he had suffered. The jury considered all of this information. On October 19, 2001, the jury returned its sentencing verdict. They found that both aggravating circumstances had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt for each murder. They recommended that DeRosa be sentenced to death on both counts. The trial judge formally sentenced DeRosa to death that same day. DeRosa appealed his convictions and death sentences to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. His attorneys raised several issues on appeal. They argued that the trial court should have granted a change of venue because of pretrial publicity. They argued that the prosecutor had made improper comments during the trial. They argued that some witness testimony and victim impact evidence had been improperly admitted. They also challenged the sufficiency of the evidence for the aggravating circumstances. On April 22, 2004, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed all of his convictions and both death sentences. The court noted that there had been some errors during the trial, including improper comments by the prosecutor and some inappropriate victim impact testimony. However, the court concluded that these errors were harmless. The evidence of DeRosa's guilt and the aggravating circumstances was so strong that the errors did not affect the outcome. DeRosa then filed a petition for a writ of certiorari with the United States Supreme Court. This petition was denied on January 10, 2005. He also filed an application for state post-conviction relief, arguing that his trial attorneys had been ineffective. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals denied that application on May 3, 2004. DeRosa then filed a federal habeas corpus petition in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Oklahoma. He raised multiple claims, including ineffective assistance of trial counsel and prosecutorial misconduct. The district court denied the petition on September 27, 2010, but granted a certificate of appealability on one issue. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals later granted certificates on two additional issues. On May 10, 2012, the 10th Circuit affirmed the district court's denial of habeas relief. The court concluded that DeRosa's attorneys had not been ineffective and that any prosecutorial misconduct or improper victim impact testimony had not affected the jury's verdict. In May 2013, DeRosa went before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. He requested that his death sentence be commuted to life in prison. He spoke to the board by teleconference from the penitentiary. He expressed his remorse and took full responsibility for the deaths. He said he was not the same man he had been in 2000. He said he had turned to religion and practiced Messianic Judaism. The victims' family members also spoke to the board. They reminded the board that DeRosa had shown their parents no mercy. Janet Tolbert described the impact on her life and said there was no closure. The board voted 3-2 against granting clemency. They refused to recommend that Governor Mary Fallin commute his sentence. On June 18, 2013, the day of his execution, DeRosa made no special requests. He did not ask for a last meal. He received the same meal that was served to all the other inmates that day. He also did not request any visits from family members or a spiritual advisor. At around noon, he was offered food, but he refused to accept it. He was moved to a cell adjacent to the death chamber in the morning to await the procedure. At 6:01 p.m., the execution began. The witnesses included 13 members of the Plummer family, including their daughter Janet Tolbert, their granddaughter Dana Gilliam, and their great-granddaughter. Also present were 5 media representatives, 2 of DeRosa's attorneys, 3 law enforcement representatives, and officials from the Department of Corrections. The warden, Anita Trammell, asked DeRosa if he had any last words. He replied, "No, ma'am." The blinds between the execution chamber and the witness room were raised. DeRosa stared up at the ceiling. He did not turn his head. The warden then said, "Let the execution begin." The lethal injection drugs were administered. DeRosa blinked several times and then began to breathe heavily. He took one last long exhale and his eyelids stopped blinking. The color began to drain from his face. At 6:07 p.m., an attending physician pronounced James Lewis DeRosa dead. He was 36 years old. After the execution was complete, the Plummer family spoke to the media. Janet Tolbert said that this was not about DeRosa. She said it was about her parents, Curtis and Gloria Plummer. She said her family was glad that justice had finally been served. She described her parents' death as horrendous and said that DeRosa's death was nothing compared to what they had suffered. Tolbert and her daughter Dana both wore white t-shirts with pictures of the Plumbers printed on the front. John Eric Castleberry, who had pled guilty and testified against DeRosa, is serving his 2 life sentences without parole at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Scotty Wayne White, who was the driver and cooperated with authorities, served his sentence and was eventually released. DeRosa became the 104th person executed in Oklahoma since executions resumed in 1990, and the 1,336th person executed in the United States since 1976. The case was finally closed more than 12 years after the brutal murders of Curtis and Gloria Plummer.